Where did you grow up and what did you want to be when you grew up?
Oh, I love this. Actually, we were packing on one of our moves and I ran into, when you write in elementary school what you want to be when you grow up? Well,
Hmm.
I found it and it's exactly what I did, which was really fun. And it was third grade. Third grade. So I grew up all over the country, first of all. So I don't even know where to say I'm from, but I always wanted to be a lawyer and then I wanted to be a judge. So I became an assistant attorney or assistant DA. And in Virginia, they're called assistant Commonwealth attorney. And then I became an assistant attorney general. But I never got to be a judge.
Although your children probably feel like you're a judge on
I,
occasion.
I've gotten to use those skills in other areas.
So you wanted to be a lawyer from the time that you were 8 years old.
Yeah.
Do you know where that came from? Did you have people in your family that were lawyers or
So
what
my
was your,
dad's a lawyer. I
okay.
have an uncle that's a lawyer. I don't know that it was from that. I have this innate justice thing
Mm.
going and, and right and wrong. And I don't know. I don't know where it came from. But, when I went to college, I knew what I was going to do. When I was just always known.
Mm.
So, where the criminal side of it came in, I'm not even sure. Very good practice for trial work.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Fascinating.
Mhm.
Okay. So you're a child, you want to grow up and be a lawyer, and unlike most people, you actually do end up doing the thing that you thought you wanted to do. We're
Yes.
going to talk about in a minute, though, how you massively disrupted yourself. But before we get there, I would love to hear, are there one or two people that as a child that you really admired or looked up to that weren't your parents necessarily? Does anyone come to
Yeah,
mind?
they do. My grandfather was one. He was an evangelist all over the world. So my dad, they grew up in China with my dad and his 5 siblings. So they were willing, to your point, to always disrupt themselves
Mm.
and be courageous in a variety of areas. The second person was one of my uncles, my uncle Hubert.
Mm. Say more. Tell us more about him.
I don't know. He is just one of my heroes as far as he challenges people to think, to not be afraid to think, to be self reflective. And yet at the same time, he's your cheerleader, he's your biggest support.
Mm.
So he's just one of those people that challenges you to be better than you are
Mm. Mm.
and to think bigger than you do.
What did he do professionally?
He was a professor. He also
Mm.
wrote a number of books. I think there is even an award in DC in the political science kind of realm about him.
What was his name? Hubert what?
Hubert Morken,
Mm.
Morken.
Mm. Mm. So good. Okay, so the sense of, and I think it's interesting. You said that your grandfather, he was an evangelist, and this idea of traveling around the world and wanting to have people live better lives and be better people. And so, as I listen to that, it's not such a surprise or such a leap that you wanted to be an attorney. Like it was that you wanted to do good in the world, and you saw an attorney being an attorney as a means of making that happen. That's
Yes.
what I'm hearing.
Yep. Yep.
Mm. All right. So you're the assistant attorney general. So your dream did, in fact, come true for
Mm.
the Commonwealth of Virginia, but then you stepped away. So what was that like? And why did you do it?
Boy, oh my goodness. Heading to the first disruption.
Mm.
So I actually got married. I was 30. And within a couple of months of getting married, my new husband asked if I would move to Pennsylvania, which I didn't even belong to the bar there. So it was a completely new thing. But you're still in that newlywed phase of I'll go wherever you want me to go. Like it's all going to be great. And
Mm.
it's so interesting. I had lunch right before I left with my mentor at the time, who what at the time was a Virginia Court of Appeals judge. He's now became a Virginia Supreme Court judge, but he took me to lunch and he threw out on the table the Newsweek magazine at the time, which the cover of it was basically it had to do with family businesses not surviving passing generations. And my husband was asking me to move to Pennsylvania to work in a family business. And my mentor, this judge, said, "Does your husband know what you're giving up? And he know what he's walking into?" And I can honestly say at the time, I had no idea to the answer of either one of those questions. But
Mm,
life has a way, it's like my dad often gives that example of gold, right? How do you really purify gold? You apply a lot of heat to it and the impurities come out. And I think we are getting ready to enter a time period of a lot of heat and pressure.
mm,
And,
mm.
so anyway.
What that conversation with your mentor, did you share that with your husband, and what did he say?
Oh yeah, but we both laughed. And actually he had gone to breakfast with somebody who said your wife is going to have a real identity crisis.
Mm,
When he came home and he said, yeah, they think you're going to have I mean, I always knew eventually I wanted to be a stay-at-home mom.
mhm.
So to me, what are you talking about? This is exactly what we've planned for. And I had no idea what I was talking about.
And did you have an identity crisis?
Oh, that would be my first disruption that I can really look back and know it was a pivotal point for me.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
So do you remember, I wanna just tease this out a little bit more, and then I wanna go to that next S curve that you went on, is when you started to have that identity crisis, because I think that that is true. It's interesting. I interviewed a few years ago a woman by the name of Jennifer Petriglieri who wrote a book called Couples at Work. And
Mm,
she talks about the power dynamic in a marriage and how when you first get married, you're making some decisions. And then when
mm,
you have your first child, you're making some decisions. And then when you're an empty nester, you're making some decisions. And these are these milestones or checkpoints.
yes.
And there's always power within that marriage. And we don't recognize it or see it, but it is in fact there. And you make that decision. And your decision to leave Virginia, leave the law, go to Pennsylvania, that was a massive, massive shift for you, especially because you thought you wanted to be a lawyer from the time you were 8 years old.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, Ruth, if you remember, because I think it would be really helpful for people who are listening. Are there one or two things that you did to help you adjust to that identity shift of jumping from one S curve to the next?
I wish I could tell you there was something I done. I did. I think I did everything wrong.
Oh, well, that's instructive as well. Do
It,
tell.
and when I say wrong, I didn't even recognize what was happening,
Mm,
except I was incredibly unhappy. We used to say, Bobby used to joke me when we lived in Richmond and I was working and he was working, that he was known as Ruth's husband.
mm,
When we moved to Pennsylvania and I didn't know a person and we lived in 9 places our first year and I hadn't waved into the bar, so I didn't have a job. I became Bob's wife. And
oof.
you already feel kind of this anonymity, like I'm not known by anyone anymore. And that sense of productivity and profitability and fruitfulness that you've had about yourself, that's all left. And then you find yourself pregnant with your first child. It is like, what in the world has happened?
Mhm,
So I don't think I didn't know what to prepare myself for. I didn't think this was going to happen because I thought, well, I always intended to do this. I mean,
mhm,
my mom did it so beautifully, so well, so seamlessly. At least I thought.
mm,
So I don't think I did it right.
mm. You know what? I really appreciate your sharing that because I think that, again, if I universalize this, when you jump to a new S curve, when you disrupt yourself and you're doing something new, which for you, again, moving to a new state, changing profession, having your first child, working in a family business, that is a lot of
So
new at one point.
and my mom has just found out she has cancer and my brother needs a heart transplant. It was all of it.
Everything.
Everything. Yeah.
Everything. Okay, so question for you. I'm wondering how the decision to start renovating houses plays into this. So what was the calculus that you were doing in your brain of starting to do this?
I think I mentioned we lived in 9 places our first year.
Yeah.
And our home in Richmond hadn't sold. And I was waiting to wave into the bar and I was newly pregnant. And we found the area. Okay, let me back up. Bob's business was in a certain part of town. He really felt for the health of our family and marriage, it would be wise not to live right near the family business.
Mm.
So we found an area we wanted to live in and we met with a realtor. And right off the bat, she asked what we could spend. And we told her, and she burst out laughing with me. I would highly recommend if you're a realtor, you never do that. But she said, you can't afford to live here.
Mhm.
So we left that meeting, went home pretty, very unhappy. She called us 2 weeks later and said, are you afraid of hard work? Not knowing what she was talking about. We said, of course not. We're like the hardest workers we know. So we met her at a house that was 150 years old. It was sliding off the foundation. I don't know if you're familiar with the movie Philadelphia Story, but it's about the Montgomery Scott estate.
Mm.
And on this estate are these 6 homes. It's called Banjo Town. It's where the help originally lived.
Mhm.
So she takes us to this house, one little bathroom. I mean, Martha Washington staircase, so you couldn't take any furniture upstairs. They had like literally a mattress on the floor upstairs. So we had to build an addition just to get furniture up. But we walk into this and she says, this is what you can afford. I just, tears pouring down my face. And Bob looks at me and says, oh, we got this. Let's go to Home Depot. Now, mind you, he started working for his father, so he's working so many hours and he started to learn. I didn't think I had a creative bone in my body.
Really?
And I had to learn. I mean, I was very linear. I was a lawyer. I didn't decorate. I didn't cook. I served him cereal for dinner. I just didn't do all this stuff. So
Mm.
I wanted to do my part, but with that comes a lot of insecurity because you're out of your lane.
Mhm.
And what happens is we do this first house. Within 18 months, we were approached by a realtor who said, I can now double your money. We sold it, got another fixer-upper. She came to us, I can double your money. We sold it within 18 to 24 months. We did this over and over and over. And we had 5 children. All
Mhm.
5 were born in different houses. And I mean, our first 4 were born in 5 years. So I'm telling you, it was like bam, bam, bam. And we're working. Bob would come home from work at 6 o'clock, say goodnight to the kids by 7:30 and work till 1 in the morning and leave at 5 in the morning. So it was a grind for years. And I just figured out how to hang wallpaper, how to determine what walls I wanted to come down. I painted,
Mhm.
and that's how we did it.
So Ruth, so you're the launch point of a new curve. You think linearly, you don't know how to wallpaper, you don't know how to paint, but you start doing this, you're able to double your money. Do you remember over and over again? Do
Mhm.
you remember a moment where you started, where you started to say, "Oh, I think I'm kind of good at
Good at
this.
this.
Oh,
I
this
think
feels pretty good. Oh, my sense of self-efficacy is back." Do you
yeah.
remember which house
And
you were in, where you were living? Describe that place and time for us.
I think it was around our 3rd house. I mean, our 2nd house we did had the largest open house they'd ever had. And it was in the middle of a rainstorm. But people wanted to see what we had done. And I had insisted that my husband brick the whole kitchen floor and build a fireplace in the kitchen. And he had really doubted me and I had insisted, but it became, I mean, I just found that I knew what people wanted.
Hmm.
And we have certain signature things we've done in each house. I put a fireplace in every kitchen.
Hmm.
And part of that was, to me, the kitchen was the center of the home. It's where I lived, it's where my kids lived. And to have that kind of space connected to it was important to me. So, I think I've talked about this before and other things, but doing a home with a spouse is a very difficult thing to do.
Hmm.
And, especially when you're talking about having 5 children, doing the work yourself. I mean, there was one home, Whitney, where, I mean, we wouldn't have a kitchen for months at a time. So whoever took a bath had to wash all the dishes in the bathtub first. So it literally, when I tell you we lived through it. Bob was babysitting for me one day. I mean, I say babysitting, they're his children, but I made him watch the 4 girls. And remember, he didn't know what to do. He was in the middle of working. He threw all these nails down on the wood floor, which at the time was just plywood, handed them each a hammer and said, just play. And he laughs to this day that that floor never creaked. Like they became a part of whatever we were doing. And
Mm-hmm.
as they got older, they would demo the houses with us. They would lay the hardwood floors. I can have my older girls, completely demo a bathroom in hours, and lay hardwood floors. So it's been so fun. And that's part, I can get into that later in the story, but to involve the family. But
Mm-hmm.
initially, we had to make sure that our marriage could survive this kind of pressure.
So what did you do? Because
That
there's a lot of pressure. I mean,
there's a lot of pressure. And I think
yeah,
that
what
what
did you
we
do?
did applies to a lot of different things. So what we would do, because remember, we didn't really have any money
Mm-hmm.
because we were also dumping everything we had into the renovations. So we
Yeah.
would go to Barnes and Noble
Mm-hmm.
because they had a coffee shop
Mm-hmm.
and they had that whole row of magazines that you could look at for free and then put them back on the counter. So we would get our coffee, and Bob and I would each have a yellow legal pad of paper. And he would look through home magazines, I would look through home magazines, and we would make a list individually of our no compromises, our desires, and then we would compare. And my list usually was a few pages long of, you're not going to change my mind, and this is my space. And his was like 2 or 3 things. So but what it did was I would then know what he really valued and mattered to him, and I could move around that.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of in the middle of a project, him wanting to change something that I found, we eliminated all of that.
Yeah.
And we were on the same page before we even started the project.
Okay. So here's a place where I think that your training as a lawyer came in very handy. And training, I don't know where you're going, but where my head just went is, as a lawyer, you probably saw over and over and over again that people were in lawsuits because they had not done the work of aligning expectations.
And
And
my
you
dad
knew how to
is a
do it.
divorce lawyer. My dad is a divorce lawyer.
Oh,
So I grew up watching him counsel couples, watching him mediate with them, and then the destruction of marriages. And my parents were in love till the day she died.
mm-hmm,
So I also knew what it took to work,
mm-hmm,
and part
mm-hmm.
of that is an ability to compromise and to give and take and to love people through a process that can be really hard.
Yeah. Wow. It's really powerful.
Mm.
Okay. So kids are growing up. 16
Mm.
years have passed since you flipped that very first house.
Mhm.
It might be time for a new S curve. Talk to us about how one of your sixth child, the hillside farm, came into your
So
life.
we land on a property. It's called Hillside Farm. It's 305 years old. William Penn deeded the first person. We are the 4th people on the deed. So every family's kept it 100 years.
Mm.
This home, there's stone walls everywhere. Stone walls had fallen. There was a 10,000 square foot barn that burned down in the 50s, and all that was left was the stone rubble. It has some guest houses, but those were completely in horrible shape. We had trees growing into the main house. I initially said no. And the reason being, not even because of the house, but the property itself was, Bob and I spent years buying the biggest house on the smallest lot we could find because we did not enjoy outdoor work.
Mm.
And
Mm.
this was a whole beast, and it was 12 acres where the woods encroached up onto the house. It had overgrown. The person selling it had sold off anything that wasn't nailed down, and even the nailed down, sold off the shutters. They were down to no money. And there were no photos of it online, which should tell you they didn't want you to see what it looked like before you came. And we ended up
Beautiful historic property.
beautiful, but
Here's the view.
so that was this house.
So were you looking for a house? I think I remember, well, I'm not going to lead your question.
Okay.
Were you looking for a house, or did someone introduce it to you? Like, how did this property come into your life?
We had been living in our prior home, I think about 2 years at this time.
Okay,
And
which is a
someone
long
left
time for you.
a long time for us. And
Yeah.
somebody had left a letter in our mailbox and said, "Can I buy your house?" So we then looked. My mom had just died,
Mhm.
and I wanted, or actually, she had died several years before, but I had wanted a place that had a guest house for my father. At this point, he hadn't remarried. He still hasn't remarried, but I just wanted a place that he could have as a home. He had gone through a great deal. My mom had had 50, I think, over 50 surgeries.
Wow.
So it had just been a really financially depleted, just everything. And I wanted just to have a place that I could provide for him.
Mhm.
So that's why this home came up. But again, we had to grapple with our kids are now all teenagers for the most part. Or I guess they weren't all teenagers. Just the oldest one was a teenager, but they were older
We're
and the
moving to.
cost was greater.
Mhm.
And I don't mean cost of project, I mean cost to our family.
Mhm.
And so we had to sit down and say, is this worth the loss of time? And we determined that as long as we did it together as a family, it was worth the time.
Mm. Mm.
So that's what we did. Literally, everyone participated.
All your children. And
Yes.
what did the debate or discussion sound like for your children? How
For
did
my
they
friend, I mean, let's
how did
just
they
say,
weigh in?
I know it was part of life at this point.
Okay,
So I
this is
think
just what your family does.
yeah, and I think it more than anything, we had to balance the playtime as much as the work time. And that was something Bob and I had to do. But I'll tell you, when my oldest got to college, she approached us and said, "Listen, I have $5,000. Can I put my money in with you, buy a house, let me be the general contractor and learn, and then let me pay for my own college." So I had kids that began to understand that
Mhm.
this wasn't just about flipping houses, it was using your money to work for you.
Right, to build wealth.
To build, and before that girl graduated, which was 2 years ago, she bought her first house and she and my husband redid it together. So it's been so much fun to watch my kids be
Yeah.
willing to quote disrupt themselves,
Yeah.
do the hard things.
Oh, so good. Can you just tell us a little bit about what the farm looks like now before I go to
Yeah.
the next question?
Oh,
Yeah.
it's awesome. In fact, we've rebuilt the barn and
Yeah.
we rehabbed both guest homes and
Mhm.
our house. It's a large stone colonial. It's on 12 acres. My husband's built me a huge herb garden outside of the kitchen, and
Mm.
I have a cutting garden for all the flowers that I could want. We put in a sport court for the kids with pickleball and basketball. We've put in a zip line. We have dune buggy.
Oh,
So my husband's made it to be where everyone wants to go.
yeah, I have to say, I was in Philadelphia 2 weeks ago, and I'm kicking myself that I didn't call you. I was still I because in my brain, you were in Virginia
Oh,
still.
yeah, no.
So, anyway, in the future. All
Yes.
right, so you shared with me the very first time we met, so thank you to Wendy Rogers for introducing us, so we have to give her a shout out, that you had refused to write the book that would become Hungry for Home. Refused it multiple times. You felt like you had nothing to say. Where did that feeling come from, Ruth?
This whole thing started with Uncle Hubert.
Oh,
I would
okay.
never even considered a book. So, do you want me to get into his visit?
Yes, I do.
Okay, so we are entering disruption number 2. And we had been living in this home for several years. And my oldest had gone to college. And for those parents out there who have had a kid leave, have chosen, for me, staying at home, I can
Mhm.
speak for that. Your identity unknowingly has become your children
Yep.
and being a mom.
Mhm.
So I felt the earth begin to literally like the tectonic plates moving underneath me. And I think for everyone that's different.
Mhm.
For me, it had to do with her leaving and who am I going to be? All of a sudden it dawned on me, they're all going to leave. And I think as moms, you think your kids are there forever. They're not. You have more life after than you do with them at home. And so it began to dawn on me, oh my gosh, trial lawyer, flipping houses. I'm getting kind of tired. Being a mom, what is that next step?
Mhm.
Well, you could say it's serendipitous or fate or God.
Providential, yeah.
Providential, which is what
Mhm.
I would say. My uncle was visiting, that same uncle. And he called me into my living room and he said, "May I ask you a question?"
I like how your uncle's holding court in with
I'm
you in your living room. In your living room.
in the kitchen cooking and he says, "Ruthie, join me in the living room." And he literally pats down on the couch and says, "Sit with me." And he said, "I have a question for you." And I said, "Sure, Uncle Hubert." And he said, "What are you 100% depending on the Lord for right now?" And I said, "Besides raising the kids?" He said, "Yes." I said, "Nothing." He said, "I know." He said, "You and Bob are so good at what you do that you don't leave any room to depend on the Lord." And I need to also say this was our story.
Mhm.
And it's not going to apply to, everybody's circumstances, but he then said, "I have a challenge for you." And my uncle knew me well enough too that to challenge me gets me moving. And he said, "I challenge you to ask the Lord to give you a vision beyond your resources, beyond your financial means, your personal capital, and your education, so that you have to depend on him." So I began to pray that all the time. And I had gone to a women's conference up in Connecticut, and the whole thing had to do with what's your purpose, plan, and passion. And I was sitting at a table with, the C-suite people. I mean, these women, rock stars in every industry. And one of them, wrote the Storybook Bible. She's English. One of them, I mean, just huge, just very accomplished women. And we were listening to some women on the panel and who were leaving their areas of expertise to go into something new. And one had said, "I can do a spreadsheet in my sleep. I don't even know how to make a cheese board." So I'm in the car driving home in tears with my best friend. And I said, "First of all, I don't know what I'm passionate about anymore other than my family. I don't know my purpose anymore because being a mom is going to end. So I definitely don't have a plan." And she started laughing and she said, "But at least you know how to make a cheese board." Now, that added some levity to the conversation, but the points were real. You don't even realize those things are changing until you're faced with disruption. And I went to another conference a few months later, a Women of Legacy conference in DC. And I met a woman who invited me to London. She had a passion for properties as well. And she had a place outside of London. And I went to her home, and our other friend, Sally Lurgence, who wrote the Storybook Bible, came as well. And we were at lunch one day at this, she had wanted us to go to this little farm for lunch. So we're sitting at lunch, and they asked me, "Why do you flip houses?" And I said, they said, "Why do you even bother unpacking if you're going to pack back up in a couple months?" And I said, "Everyone's hungry for home." Both of them pick up their computers, and one looked at the other and said, "It's not taken." And I said, "What's not taken?" And they said, "The name." And I said, "The name is for what?" And she said, "For the book you're supposed to write." I said, "Oh, no. I'm not writing a book." To your point earlier, a lot of books or several books had been written about people in my family, or they had written books. And it was the one thing I said I would never want to do. And particularly at this stage of my life, I didn't feel like I had anything to offer. I knew the one thing I was passionate about. I think given, I mentioned, my grandfather being an evangelist. Growing up, we had people in and through our homes constantly. And it was formative for me. I learned that our family wasn't just blessing those people by giving them a place of respite and feeding them, but we were changing by our exposure to people from every walk of life. And in our home, there have been years we've had company more than not. And so I knew that what I was passionate about was, how do you use home, whether that's cooking, your family recipes, gardening, entertaining, or decorating, how to use those things to be a blessing to other people. But I didn't know how that would translate into a book.
Got it.
Because I'm not a chef. I'm not a decorator. I'm not, an expert in any of these fields. So there were a number of things that happened after that event that really, I knew beyond a shadow of a doubt I was supposed to do it. So,
Okay. I have two questions. Number one, what was your grandfather's name? Just because you've referenced him.
David Morgan. Mm-hmm.
David Morgan. Okay. And you said that he was a colleague of Billy Graham's. Is that right?
Yes. Or was it? We were in a Bible study early on, and then they would do each other's what were the big, anyway, they're big conferences all over the world together.
Okay, perfect. Just to give people some context.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so one thing I would love for you to share is the one story that you said, and we won't have this on recording, but there was a story about like, if it looks like this, remember the picture of something? You said, if there, I remember you saying, I think you were in London and you said there was a picture of the exact farm or idea. And you said, then I'll know that it's time for me to write a book. Do you remember
No,
that?
okay. Well, I'll finish the story for you really quick.
Okay. All right. Okay. So, let me ask a question to lead into it. So you said there were a number of experiences that you were like, oh no,
Mhm.
so I don't want to write this book. I don't have anything to say.
Yes.
But you've had all these life experiences that other people are saying to you, hey, Ruth, you do have something to say.
Mhm.
What happened that caused that feeling to flip and say, not flip houses, but flip your feeling? I need to do this. What happened?
Remember, I'm continuing to pray this entire time. Vision beyond my
Mhm.
resources, right?
Mhm.
I get home from this trip to London and I'm talking to my sister. And I said, you're going to laugh, but they think I need to write a book. She burst into tears on my back porch and said, you're supposed to do this. You have no idea. Your understanding of intentionally creating family culture is something people need to hear.
Mhm.
It's not about the house. It's family and culture. So she said, would you talk to an author that I know? And I said, I'm happy to do that. I'm not writing this book. This author flies to my house and we meet for a number of days where she kind of interviews my family. And she said, Ruth, at the end of the week, she said, I'd like to collaborate with you and write a book on how to create a healthy family
Mhm.
and use that family for basically people. And I said, I'm not going to do it. This is so far out of my lane. I didn't feel equipped. I didn't feel capable. I didn't feel like, nor did I even have a desire. I didn't even, anyway. So the last day before she leaves, she and my sister went shopping all day. They come into my living room. I'm sitting on that same couch I had been sitting with Uncle Hubert. She hands me two,
The crowd.
oh yeah, the couch. Hands me two wrapped presents. And I opened the first one and it was a teapot. And she said, whenever you're wondering what that next step is or that vision beyond your resources, I want you to have a cup of tea. I burst out laughing and I said, oh, Jess, I don't drink tea and I'm not writing a book. I mean, because it had become a joke. Like
Yeah.
she said, before you open your second gift, your sister and I looked all over the city. We went to a number of home stores, bookstores, gardening stores. If we ever saw a book, what would it look like? In my estimation, knowing now who you are, what would it look like? And this is the book that came up with. I was like, this is interesting. I open the packaging and I said, where is this place? And she's like, I don't know. We turn it to the back of the book. It's the farm outside of London that Sarah had taken me to. When I tell you, Whitney, it was like getting struck by lightning. I mean, the chances of that, they didn't know where I had gone.
Right.
They had no idea of all the places in the world. And I literally burst into tears and said, I will do it.
That's beautiful. Okay. One of my favorite pictures from your book.
Yes.
All the hydrangeas, the whole
Mhm.
book. I love it. I love it. I was reading through it again the other night, and just reading through it creates a sense of happiness
Yeah.
and helps you feel less hungry because it feels like making a home where people feel loved
Hmm.
and seen and valued is more possible.
Yeah.
So,
Whitney, I was asked when I was being interviewed at something, what do you say to all the people that think you've just created the perfect home?
it's a great question.
And I don't remember if it was when Country Home interviewed me or something else. And I actually started crying in the interview because my purpose has never been to create the perfect home. It's been to create a safe place to not be perfect in.
Mm.
And for people to be able to come in and feel like they can let their guard down and they can be vulnerable.
Mhm.
So, and rest. So that
Mm.
has been my purpose, not only for our immediate family, but for anyone who walks through the doors.
I was wondering about this. So this idea, we talk a lot about workflows and hierarchies and structuring relationships. And, as you're describing this, a household is also a system. And I'm just wondering, what are you talked about this idea of people being able to come in and be vulnerable and safe, creating a system of belonging. What are one or two things that you do, probably very instinctively, such that when people come into your home, they do feel that way?
I
They
actually
feel
love that question. And the reason why is it didn't start out being instinctive.
it wasn't.
Um,
Okay.
a bit of a perfectionist in that originally I wouldn't want people to come unless everything was perfect. And my mom said to me once, before she died, Ruth, hosting, there's a difference between a host and, oh, I forget the word she said, but she said, it's not about perfection or performance.
Mm,
It's about making people loved.
mm,
And I have found that to be so true. Even if I go into someone's house where there's nothing out of order, it is an immediate sense of you need to remain in order.
mm,
I go into a home where there's disarray or, the children are running around or, just things aren't even clean. I can put my feet up and be me.
mm,
But I had to get to that understanding that that is what makes people feel loved. It isn't about the host. And I think that's what she was trying to let me know. People know when the entertaining is about the host as opposed to the guest. And
that's
so my focus has been about how does the guest know it's about them?
mm,
So, whether I'm cooking my Ruth's Barely Baked cookies and I have several hundred in my freezer already in balls that I immediately take out when someone arrives, or I find out if you're staying with me, all your favorite things and try to have those put in a basket. I am wanting them to know it's about them, if that makes sense.
wow. Completely. It's interesting that you say that. So you're making the person who's coming into your home the hero of the story. You're
It's,
not the hero of the story.
I don't even want you to see my house. Do you know
Yeah.
what I'm saying?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
You just want people to feel welcome. It's
Yeah.
interesting. I remember I don't know if you're familiar with Donald Miller's work. We just had him on the podcast recently. He's the Story Brand fellow, and he talks about the idea of when you're selling or marketing, if you there's such a tendency for a person who's selling to be the hero as opposed to making the person who
Yes.
you are selling to or talking to or whatever, that they're the hero. And so I think that's really beautiful of going to that place of this is not about me. It's about serving and helping you feel welcome. And I love that idea of creating a gift basket for people. There's a lot of intentionality with that.
It
But
is. I was talking to one of my cousins once because my sister asked me once, why does everyone go to your house? And I made a joke and I said, oh, it's because I cook well for them. But my cousin overheard that and he said, and here he is in his 50s.
mhm,
He looks at me, he said, it has nothing to do with that. They know they're loved in your house.
mhm,
And that is an intentional. We've raised our kids that way.
yeah,
They're the ones doing the dishes, clearing the table, making conversation with every adult that walks through the door. But yeah, to your point on the baskets, I try to find out everyone's favorites and
mhm,
have that in their room and bring you into our family as opposed to um, you being separate. Does that make any
mhm.
sense?
Yeah, it makes complete sense. And I think I want to just make another observation and then ask you about your television show.
Yeah.
So the observation that I'm having is that you described the experience that you had as a child of people from all over the world coming into your grandparents' home and probably by extension your parents' home. So that welcoming people into your world is actually part of your DNA.
It is. And I'll tell you because you asked me at the very beginning, where are you from? We moved so much that place did not represent home to me. But my family's culture and the traditions, and the traditions are a big part of my book. I do our family traditions all year throughout the whole book.
Yeah,
How do those things create your family culture? And
yeah.
if you don't, someone said, I don't have a family culture. Everyone does. Be intentional about creating it because it's going to happen.
Yeah.
So how do those things help? And you're right. We lived with my grandparents for a time. And by extension, my mom would bring in the homeless people into our house. It didn't even matter.
Mhm.
So, but it was formative for me. And
Yeah. So, tell us about your television show. This was,
so, so
another disruption, unexpected new S-curve, right?
podcast last year, she said, "So what is your fourth chapter?" I said, "What are you talking about?" She goes, "It's coming." I said, "What are you talking about?" She said, "The Law of Flipping Houses, the book. What's the fourth?"
Uh-huh.
And I had started because when I wrote the book, I didn't have any social media. And I'm
Mhm.
sure what you know now is everyone's demanding that authors or anyone bring something to the table, social media wise.
Yeah.
And I started an Instagram. I didn't know what to do. I hate social media. And I don't like the focus on me. So I started doing something called Tip Tuesdays on my Instagram, on my Hungry for Home Instagram, where I would give tips of family traditions or gardening or cooking or things like that. Well, I was called about a year ago by a show called Homeworthy, who had heard about my house. And I looked them up and I knew from the website that they go into, top designers worldwide into their homes and get their story. And so I told her, "You don't want to come to my house." I mean, Bob and I used to go take the kids and go to garage sales and estate sales. It is not a designer home.
Mhm.
Let me interrupt this one little story. They were putting my home in a book called Stone Houses, and they had a photographer come from New York City and like photograph for over a week. And we
Oh,
initially came in the house, and I knew who he was and I knew the type of work he had done. So I was very nervous. He was silent when he walked through my house, and he gets into the kitchen and I said, "Sir, is everything okay?" And he said, "I have one word to say." And I said, "What's that?" He said, "I'm home." And I thought, you couldn't give me a better compliment if you
wow.
know. So
Wow.
the show, she called and she said, "I'm interested in you and your story and the home story." So she came. That was their first show to ever hit 1 million views. And they did it, relatively quickly. And they called me and said, "Would you be willing to do a few other things for me?" So I did. I hosted an entertaining episode and someone else's home. And then they called before Christmas and said, "We'd like you to design your own show."
Mhm.
So it's, and I said, again, I'm out of my lane.
There's a theme here, by the way, out of your way, out of your lane.
The courage to step out. And I think that that's what I would recommend people in those times of disruption is, yeah, to have courage and to surround yourself. I have my own little wisdom circle of people who have more courage for me than I do for myself,
Mhm.
and that are willing to push me when I don't want to be pushed. And so this was one of those things. So I'm doing cooking and entertaining and gardening, and I just did an Easter episode. And so we'll see. I've signed a year contract with them. So
Are you enjoying it, Ruth?
I am, but you know why? I think I've had so many people reach out to me saying what a blessing it's been to either the woman who's going through similar things that I've gone through,
Mhm.
or to the family who, I think as a nation, we are moving so quickly,
Mhm.
and our children are involved in everything they can be involved in or we want them involved in.
Mhm.
And there's no time for family
Mhm.
and to develop family.
Mhm.
And, we read out loud several nights a week as a family. And
Even
my,
now, even
even,
now.
hmm and it might be outside by the fire pit. We're reading Boys in the Boat or, but it's 15 minutes. We can't always, I had 5 athletes. We
Mhm.
can't always sit down at a meal. But again, to the intentional portion, I had to intentionally say, we are setting aside this time to be together. And there's
Mhm.
something about reading out loud in front of a fireplace or a fire pit that it quiets everybody. And
Mhm.
then we have a conversation about, okay, what are you
Mm.
doing today? What are you struggling with?
Mm.
And it's kind of taken the place of the family meal that we can't always all be at.
Yeah. I was gonna ask you for a tip, but I think that's your tip.
That's it.
That's your tip, and so I would add to so you said Boys in the Boat. I think you mentioned The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe in your
We've
book.
done all of them. Tolkien, C.S. Lewis. We've done World War II novels. We've done one of my sons he's just loves all sports. So we'll pick a favorite, whether it's Tom Brady or Tim Tebow, somebody that he loves, and we'll read about them. And again, when they were younger, the younger kids would do their Legos and listen, but they knew what the time meant.
Yeah.
And so
good.
again,
All right.
at home, it can look very different. It doesn't have to.
Yeah, but again, it's something really concrete that most people can do. So I love that. So I would, you mentioned, I was going to ask you about a favorite recipe, but you mentioned your cookies. Is that a favorite recipe?
No, they're called Ruth's Barely Baked chocolate chip cookies.
Okay, I've got to make them.
Yeah.
And if we can include a link to that in the show notes. All right. So before I go to my final two questions, is there anything that you wanted to say that you feel like I didn't cover?
Is there anything that I left out?
No, you hit the high points of where we wanted to go. So so my question for you, Ruth, is
I think if I could say something, it would be not to be afraid of disruption.
Okay, so you'll say that at the end.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask you two questions. One is, what's been useful for you in this conversation? And then I'll ask you to sort of tie it up with a bow, and so you
What's
can.
been useful for me?
Yeah. So it's a question that I ask when I coach, but I always ask it on the podcast as well, because, I was thinking about this before we started, about this idea of home is when I actually invited you into my home, which is interesting. It's an interesting metaphor. But I guess the question I would ask of you as you sort of sign that gift book of what did you learn about yourself? Did you have an aha? Did you have just what was useful for you about this particular conversation?
I think anytime you take the time to reflect on your own story and those points of disruption, it's a reminder, particularly if you're in a bit of a disruption currently, which I am with doing the show. It's that reminder that I'm going to get through it and what it took to get through it and how to do it well. And that was a good reminder, because I look at, for me, God's faithfulness in my past and the importance of being on the same page as my husband and how to ask for help in places that I'm uncomfortable. And I'm in all of that right now. So that was helpful for me to just look through that again and know it's going to be okay.
To look at your patterns and like, oh yeah, I've actually got this muscle, and you just did you put in a few reps by thinking through it. I love that. Okay. So what are your final thoughts that you would like to share with us?
I would say, don't be afraid of disruption. I think people have a tendency not to want to be uncomfortable or pressed to let the heat rise, right? And when you realize that it's actually strengthening you, and it's kind of like people say, don't be afraid of failure, but people don't like to do hard things. Leave them in their comfort zone. And I think one of the things I've really pressed in with my kids is you don't get stronger. That muscle memory will not grow without pressure and without hard things. So I would say, don't be afraid of it, because it's going to end up ultimately to be used for your benefit.
Yeah. Not only not be afraid of it, but seek it out is what you're saying.
And press into it. Yes.
Yeah. Ruth, thank you so much. It's been lovely.
I've loved it. Thank you so much, Whitney.